Hey everybody, welcome back to the Dundee Church Podcast, here from lovely Omaha, Nebraska, Dundee Presbyterian Church. My name is J.D. Georlett. I'm the senior pastor here at Dundee Presbyterian Church. I'm joined again, and isn't it right? It would be completely wrong if Keith Holmes was not with me.
You're so
Although
kind.
I can hardly wait to find out what that... I'm sorry.
So kind.
Yes. There'd be something missing if Keith was not here.
Well, one day I'll retire.
Yes.
And,
Perish.
chances are better I'll just end up going crazy or going into dementia and just going, Who are you? What are you doing?
Something to look forward to.
Yes,
all right.
always good to know.
Off to a roaring start here at the Dundee Church Podcast. If you've been following along with us, we're working through the book of John. In this episode, we'll be covering John chapter 13, verses 21 through 38. So take a moment now and read those verses. Shut off the podcast. Slowly read those verses. Get the scene in your mind. It's very easy to visualize this scene. It's the Last Supper scene today.
Yep.
And then come back and join our discussion. We're just here. What are we doing here, Keith? We're trying to provide some support to people's Bible study and devotional time.
It's just if you're reading through it, come along with us.
Yeah.
We're having a great time. It's a wonderful read. I think the whole book of the Bible is a great read, honestly.
Right. But the book of John, without question, this is why we've taken a deep dive, going slowly through this book to give you a chance to really study and hear the word of the Lord. John chapter 13, verses 21 through 38. We begin today with the question, what was the hardest thing that you have ever had to learn? Keith, what would you say to that question, my good man?
Well, obviously the quickest answer that popped into my mind when I read the question was that life's not fair. That is the hardest lesson we all have to learn, that we are living in a broken and fallen world, and life ain't fair.
So that has been one that's hard for you personally, not just generally, but
exactly.
You've had hard. So would it be safe to say that you have an expectation that life would be fair and that had to die to a certain extent?
Oh, yeah. I grew up in a house, and until her death, Mom always wanted to be fair. She was a people pleaser and an equalist. Everything needed to be equal. I had two brothers, so if one brother got something, the other two needed to get something. Maybe not as big. birthdays were a mess for her, I'm sure, because it was all about one boy. But she felt so bad that the other two didn't get something that we got. If it was,
that's nice.
But everything was equal, and that was the way I was raised with her. My dad, on the other hand, was doing everything he could to prove that that's not true. That life isn't fair, and that and so I think one time. I still remember this. How about that? I was a young teenager, 13, 14 years old, 15, and I was playing baseball, and my dad was umpiring the game, and it came down to the plate. I was sliding into the plate, and he called me out.
Oh, gosh.
And I still, to this day...
You're safe.
40 some odd
Jackie
years
Robinson
later,
and Yogi Berra,
right? I was safe. He had to call me out because he was my father, and he couldn't call me safe in such a situation because people would think he was being unfair.
You had to learn.
And I pretty much stopped playing after that. I still remember that I lost all the joy of that sport after that.
Well, Yogi Berra took it to his grave that Jackie Robinson was out at the plate in 1955, I think it was, World Series. Jackie Robinson stole home. That's interesting.
Yeah.
You had that with your father.
Yep.
For me, the hardest thing that I ever had to learn literally was the Greek language.
Oh, yeah.
During seminary, the New Testament, unfortunately, is written in Greek. Yeah. And it's not written in English. It's written in Greek. And if you really want to understand it, you've got to study Greek.
Right.
And I'm telling you, Greek is impossibly hard to learn. And there's always these... What makes it worse is there's always these annoying... I don't care where you take that class.
Right.
There's always these annoying people that get it. They
Right.
get A's on all the tests.
Right.
And it's really hard to love those people. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah. But it is seminary, so you have to.
Yeah, you've got right, exactly.
You can't find a dark alley.
I am a Christian, so I can't hate this human being. But it was terribly hard. I was terrible
I get
at
it.
it.
I get it.
And I got it. I got through, and I survived, and did fine. But it was very painful. And then, in a larger sense, that's the literal subject material that was ours. But I would say, along your lines, saying that life is not fair and the struggle to learn that, I wasn't raised the way you were, and the idea of life not being fair is a fairly easy lesson for me, perhaps compared to you. But then a really hard lesson that I'm still trying to learn is that, by the way, JD, you're not in charge, and you're not in control. And I think you're way ahead of me on that one. Everybody, that's not much of a compliment because I think everybody's ahead of me on that one.
It's a low bar.
I am still trying to learn, and isn't it the truth? And it just brings up your point and my point. I think brings up these things that God is still trying to teach us that it takes years for us. And maybe we never really get it. But I get into so much trouble, and there's so much detriment to my spirit just from the standpoint of me just not accepting the fact that I'm not in charge.
Yeah.
I'm not in control.
Yep.
And
the harder I wrestle for it, the worse it gets.
The worse it gets.
Yeah.
It's just like some sort of a puzzle. It gets tighter the more you struggle.
Yeah.
We're in John 13, verses 21 through 38, as I said. How would you, as you read this scene, this is the Last Supper scene. This is the just following the washing of the feet. We talked about that last episode.
Yep.
How would you describe the disciples in this scene? And why are they the way that they are?
You know, you mentioned, and this was weird, it just popped into my head as you talked about your Greek lessons in seminary. I wonder, because I took Latin and some Greek in
that's
college,
a walk in the
right?
park.
And that is compared to Greek.
But I don't know. I took Latin too. And it's not easy.
But the declensions of verbs are the same. The structure of some of the Latin sentences are a lot of the same.
Did a Roman soldier come along and make you write it on the wall?
100 times. Romans go home. But what I think it was for me when I took the Greek part of that, I failed that part pretty miserably. But it was because it was so foreign to me. Yeah. And I think what we're seeing here is disciples hearing something that's foreign to their ears. They don't understand because, number one, they've been raised a certain way to believe that the Messiah would be this great conquering king, and that, they've been following this man for 3 years. And I'm getting you get the sense of, well, if you're going to die, what have we been doing? What have I done? I was a successful fisherman, maybe, or I was a tax collector. Sure, I had to have a Roman guard wander around with me, but I had money, I had friends, air quotes going on there, and so I just think it was just, they didn't get it because almost to the point where they didn't want to, or they couldn't because it was just so foreign.
Well, I think I love that you put that in that foreign to them. I love that phraseology.
Yeah.
And you're obviously right. Clearly from this scene, they just don't get it.
Right.
And it's interesting to speculate the second. Why are they the way they are? I think you make a good point that he's talking about dying, and it's natural whether you're a fisherman or a tax collector or anything at all to see anything good in dying. Right. That there could be any success or any blessing that could come, or any victory that could. We're just naturally predisposed to resist death, to stay away from it, to stay alive, to keep breathing. That's our, reptilian brain functioning.
Right.
Stay alive. Whatever
stay
you do,
alive.
sacrifice everything, throw everything else overboard, but stay alive. And here's Jesus saying, talking about his death and the need for that death. That this has to happen to fulfill all righteousness. All this, he's talking about that constantly, all the way up to this point, and it is foreign to them. But I also think, Keith, that they are the way they are. They're dull to. I would use the word that they're dull to what Jesus is talking about and to what Jesus is, and they have been throughout. I think it's because one of the things is also that they, like me, don't feel as if they have anything new to learn. And there's a very different perspective, I think, that Jesus obviously has of us than that we have of ourselves.
Absolutely, right?
And we've talked about this before. When he looks at us, he sees lost sheep. When we look at us, we're like we've got it together.
Yeah.
Of course, Jesus caught me.
Chose me.
He needs me.
He needs me.
And the mentality is just completely and totally different.
Right?
Jesus isn't looking at them and saying, "I need these guys."
Well, it's interesting how we fluctuate. I mean, I just think of Peter, who earlier in this whole thing 3 years ago was the one that was said, "Leave me, Master. I'm not worthy. I'm a sinner. Get away from me."
Yeah.
And now he's like, "Oh, I'm never going to leave you, Jesus. I'm going to go to the cross. I'll die with you if that's what it takes." And like, no, Peter, you're not. You're not going to do that because you're human. It's just not. You're going to run away. You're going to do these things that come natural to you.
He doesn't have an accurate perspective of himself, and you would think that would be the very thing that we would be really, really good at.
Right.
And ironically, Jesus reveals that thing that we really should be good at, having an accurate perspective of ourselves, is in fact the thing that we are probably worst at.
And not only that, I come back to your idea of wanting to be in charge, how we falsely think we're in charge. How much more in control can we be than to say, "I'm going to die"?
Right.
I choose my death.
Right.
That the ultimate in charge, the ultimate control. The only thing I know is I will die, and I'm going to pick that time when. And Jesus is like, "No, you're not."
To take our assumption of control and project it into the future is ridiculously arrogant. I mean, the one thing that you don't have any idea about is the future, and you're sitting there saying, "Well, I don't know what the future is, but whatever it is, I'm going to
be in control.
I'm going to be defining it.
I'll be the one to decide what's going to happen."
Yeah, I mean, we're laughing because when you do get to that point, it's funny.
You reduce it to the ridiculous, right? You're just to the point where it's like, what do you mean you're going to do? You have no idea what you're going to do next. Somebody could walk through that door and shoot you. You have no idea what's going to happen.
Yeah.
I mean, and he tells us, you're not guaranteed your next breath.
Right.
And yet here we are, just like the man who built himself those big granaries. I'm going to decide what happens.
Exactly. This is how it's going to go down.
Yeah.
And this is how I'm going to behave. These are, big question here. Hard, I mean, we could talk. There's been books written about this next question, and the question is, how should we interpret Judas?
Right.
In this scene?
Unfair. He was forced to do it.
Well,
it was no. That's not.
I mean, there's. I agree with you. That's not a right interpretation. There's a lot of wrong interpretations.
Right.
I am always, whenever the topic of Judas comes up in Bible study or in conversation, and it does. There's inevitably, and over many years, people will say, "Well, he was predestined to do this. Yeah. It was prophesied that he would do this, and so he isn't responsible for what he did at all because that was unavoidable."
I can't agree with that.
No, I can't either. And I always caution people: well, don't take responsibility away from him. Right. Don't take that off of him. Don't sit there and say, "Well, this is all part of the plan, and this is how Jesus got crucified, so it had to be there." And so it's not that big of a deal. It is a big deal what Judas did. It is a true. Just because it was prophesied, just because God knew that it was going to happen, does not mean that it wasn't an evil act.
Yes, exactly. I think the same thing of all of the shootings that we've been having lately, all those things that you hear from around the world. It's like, well, God knew, sure, he knew that we were sinners, and he knows that we're going to fail and we are going to not be holy. And so to say, well, then it's all God's fault is silly, because it's like, no, God doesn't want this. God doesn't want this. God wanted to spend the entirety of eternity with us in the Garden of Eden. He didn't mess up.
Right.
We did. Right. And so, you can't. I find it very hard to say, "Oh, poor Judas. I absolve him of responsibility because he was the one that was chosen."
So now that we've covered that base, and I'm glad that we did. How would you interpret Judas in this scene? What's going on with him? And how does he strike you as a human being, or what's going on in his mind and that sort of thing?
I'm afraid I might have been tainted too young at a too young age by Jesus Christ Superstar, because the name of the name of that show is a misnomer. If you ever I've never seen that show, that musical, because it's about Jesus. No, it's not. It's about Judas. That's a story about Judas, whom what he sees, and I think it's an accurate interpretation. He's scared. He's of the mind of the Pharisees. That is, Jesus is making way too much noise, and Rome is going to come in and crush us under their heel if you keep going on. I have to stop. I'm the guy that's going to have to be the one that's in control and stop this for the sake of Israel and the what I perceive as the right way to do things. So I'm going to have to be the one to turn him in.
Do you think he's aware? Does he have a good self-awareness? I think you might be right in that. But I don't think he has. I don't think he's telling himself that I'm doing something bad, that I'm betraying.
No, I don't. I think he's thinking I'm doing the right thing. I'm doing the good thing.
A courageous,
right.
A courageous.
I have to be the one to stop this.
Right.
Rome will crush us if this guy keeps going on.
The Sanhedrin, the Jewish authorities will crush us if this goes on.
I think he just comes from a place of, I want to be the one that dictates how this is supposed to go, and therefore, because I know I've heard this from the synagogue, I've heard this from the temple. I'm the one that's going to have to end this, because obviously it's for the good of the people that I do this.
There's been other people that have speculated. Now you've given a legitimate theory. There's other people that have speculated that Judas wanted to bring Jesus together with the Jewish authorities to negotiate some kind of a thing.
Sure.
Like he was going to be the peacemaker, the liaison,
okay,
the ambassador.
I see that too. Yeah.
And then we speculate in that it went horribly wrong, and then of course he had regret, and he threw the pieces of silver back, and he wasn't getting paid to betray. He was getting paid to bring these people together and negotiate some kind of a peaceful thing.
Right.
Of course, Jesus wasn't there. I bring not to bring peace, but a sword and all this kind of stuff.
Right.
And everybody's speculated and written many books about these things. I'm not here to do that. I'm not here to try to figure out exactly why he did what he did, but I'm more interested in his mentality. And when I think about Judas, I think about something I learned several years ago about the line between being naive and being arrogant. Two words that you would think are very different kinds of mentality. I would argue that the line between them is very, very thin, where you can be both of those things simultaneously.
Oh, I think so, absolutely.
Where you're just naive about people and about situations, about who you are and about what people are capable of doing, and yet you're also arrogant about your own abilities to make things happen and get things done. And I don't know about Judas. He's a fantastic mystery about how evil he is, how much he control. It says that the devil entered him.
Yeah, I was going to say a lot of that he was a peacemaker kind of falls apart when John says, "Oh, and the devil entered him."
Right.
I don't know that the devil was going to try and make peace. But
the devil is very good at misleading us and lying to us.
That's true. That's true.
So it's great because you can get published a lot talking about Judas. There's too much to talk about.
Yep.
And nobody knows exactly for sure, but I think that it fits in with the fact that even all of these guys, all 12 of these guys, going back to our original question, had much to learn, much more to learn. They were completely unaware of how little they knew.
Right.
And Judas acts out of that in very destructive ways. But so does Peter. And you made a little of an allusion. You began to allude to that situation. And it's very, very interesting to play and question Peter's actions in relationship with Jesus over and against Judas's actions in relationship with Jesus, and that's a very interesting conversation. But getting back to Judas, how are we to interpret Judas? a guy that doesn't get who Jesus is, doesn't want what Jesus is, and I don't think really understands himself very well.
I think
either.
we've talked about how Judas was unhappy with the way Jesus was doing Jesus, and that he needed to straighten Jesus out.
Yeah.
He's like, you're doing it wrong. Here's how you need to be the Messiah.
That's a really good segue to our next question, which I have as being the question is, how is God glorified? And we know now that when Jesus in this passage talks about God being glorified through the Son, he is saying that the God that we worship is glorified through the suffering of the suffering servant.
Right.
Isaiah 58, where the suffering servant comes into our world and takes upon himself the diseases, the infirmities of us all, carries the cross of our shame, all this kind of stuff. God is glorified by putting on human flesh, becoming incarnate, coming into our world, and taking and suffering and dying for our sins. We need to make that statement. Jesus brings God glory, not by sitting on a throne, not by being celebrated as a conquering hero, but by being a suffering servant. By washing feet, God is glorified. By teaching, by loving the unlovable, by bringing light into a dark world, by dying for our sins, by being the atoning sacrifice, by suffering. These are the ways, and that is just so counterintuitive.
Oh my gosh, it's so counterintuitive,
isn't it? Why is it so?
Because people just don't understand how can any of what you just went through bring God glory.
Exactly.
God's a powerful, shining being who sits upon a throne hurling lightning. Wait a minute, that's the wrong one, isn't it?
Right. That would be Zeus.
Right? Okay, wait. God is this ethereal love that just surrounds us, and the whole world is God. Oh wait, no, that's Buddhism. No, right? We all can put the wrong picture of God together, except God. God put the right picture together when He put His image into His Word, the Bible. This is where we have to go to see what God is like. And what God is telling us in this is exactly what you've just said. I'm going to come as a human being, as a baby in a manger.
To a poor family. Not to a well-connected family.
Right. Not to a king, not to an emperor.
Not in a palace.
Right. Not in a palace. I will be for all.
Right.
Because even shepherds can come to me.
Right.
Matter of fact, they're going to be the first ones to show up.
They get an invite.
Right. And so, and I mean, and that's just the beginning of the story.
Right.
I mean, from then on, it's just crazy what goes on.
What you're saying to me is, what I'm hearing you say is, JD, before you get into the Jesus story, buy into the fact that it's not going to make sense or not to anything else that human beings prioritize.
Exactly. We don't conceive this. You know, it's often been said in my life that, you know, the Bible has to be true because nobody in their right mind would write this story about a Savior this way.
Right.
We all expect them to be Zeuses, to be Buddhas, to be, you know, the love or to be the power. And it's like, no, He was love and power in such a way that he was also mercy and grace and he's justice and all this, and it's unfathomable to us. Either you get justice or you get grace, one or the other. You don't get both. You know.
And when we watch the disciples, we're watching a bunch of guys who have a front row seat to watching God do and be these things in their midst, and they can't handle it. They can't get it. And of course, Peter is singled out because Peter just he speaks his consciousness. He speaks what's on.
No filter, I think, is what we'd say today.
Right. He thinks while he's talking. So I'm very gracious to him for that. He's saying things that the other disciples are thinking and feeling and struggling with. He's just the voice. He's just the mouthpiece of what they're feeling. Right. But he is struggling with everything that you're talking about, and that gives us freedom to struggle with those things too. They have a front row seat to watching God be everything that you just described, and everything that God is doing is completely counterintuitive to everything that we think that that victory that a great king should be.
Well, then, and I think you're absolutely right. But why does Peter protest? I want to move along and ask, why does Peter protest not being able to go with Jesus? You mentioned that he's the everyman, that he's the one that speaks for all of us almost. Well, why does he protest then? Why would we protest not being
That's what
able
you're
to
really
go?
asking,
Really, I mean,
isn't
let's
it?
put ourselves in this
Well,
story again,
that's
right?
That's good to ask. I mean, in context, if you haven't read, and we hope you've read, we told you to read. Why haven't you read? Come on, people. If you've read these verses, Jesus starts talking about once Judas leaves.
Right. Which, by the way, how did they not know it was Judas?
I know.
I know. It begs the
Talk
question,
about dull,
right? Exactly. You wonder if there's some kind of divine intervention, and I almost think there was, because if there wasn't that dulling of their wits, they would have gone, "It was Judas.
Right.
We got to go get him before he can do this."
Well, that's certainly biblical. There are certain scriptures that
Right.
show that God dulls our hearts,
Right.
hardens our hearts for His purposes. He
Right.
did that with Pharaoh, and it's very interesting. That's a whole other discussion.
yeah.
But they are clueless as to what's going on with
Right.
Judas, and it's just baffling.
Oh, he
that
must
they
just
can't
be
know.
going to give to the poor or whatever it was that John said. Yeah.
But it's interesting because as soon as Judas leaves the room, it's like Jesus waits for the door to close. He's watching. Okay, the door's closed. Judas is gone. Now I'm going to talk about me being glorified,
Right.
and about God being glorified through me, and it's going to happen through suffering. And then he starts saying, I'm going to go somewhere you can't follow.
Right.
I'm going to leave you. You're going to look for me. You're not going to be able to find me. I'm going. You can't follow.
Right.
And what you're asking is about Peter then, of course, protesting. He's like, why can't I go? I can go. I can go where you
Right.
can go. I'm going to die with you. And, of
Right.
course, then Jesus does, come on, Peter, before the cock crows, you're going to deny me 3 times. And, of course, he does. Why does Peter protest? Not because I think, like me, perhaps like you, although you're a better man than I am, he protests because out of his assumption of his own greatness. He assumes that again, we talked about this a little bit. Yeah. You talked about it well before, about how he projects his own ability to control, his own ability to achieve, his own ability to follow
Right.
into the future, that he knows nothing about it at all.
Right.
I mean, he has an overblown sense of himself, of his own abilities, of his own. And his own devotion to Jesus, his own courage, his own everything. Yeah. Haven't you ever thought that in this situation I would do this, or I would say that, or whatever? And you're like, come on, give me
I don't know if I've ever said this on the podcast before, but I was working retail when I was younger, and I had a gun pointed at me.
Oh my gosh!
The store I was working at was being robbed, and they thought I was the manager, and so they pointed the gun at me.
Go after the tall guy.
Right, get after the big guy, and so. It's funny. I tell the story to certain people, and they're like, "Oh, I would have knocked that gun out of their hand." No, you wouldn't. Mm-mm. Until you have had a gun pointed at you, that because the fact of the matter is, the guy just wanted the money out of the till. That's all he wanted. Yeah. He was you could see it in his eyes and his face. He was desperate. Right.
But you didn't.
But
people don't know what they're talking about.
Right. It's like, everybody get back in the back room. All right? Everybody, let's get in the back room. This guy wants money. Let's just go to the back room and we'll all be fine.
Right.
And honestly, that was my thinking. Back then I wasn't a black belt in Taekwondo, but even as a black belt, I can tell you, give him the money. Right. We just think we know what we would do. You say that, and how many people have told me, "Oh, I would have found a way to knock that gun out of his hand." No, you wouldn't have.
And along those lines, part of our relationship with Jesus is to let that go. Is to be open to. To the possibility that we might fail in that situation, or just be open to Him writing that story.
Right.
Yes.
In case you're wondering, I am not comparing Jesus' love for us and guidance as he's pointing a gun at us. But I'm just saying, we fail in the idea that we think we know what we're going to do in a situation, and you don't.
How do you see the difference between how Jesus handles Judas and how Jesus handles Peter here?
It's interesting. I think both of them are given their orders. Jesus gives them their what they're going to do.
Yeah.
You know, he tells them, because both of them, I mean, who knows? Up until this point, Judas might have just been thinking, oh, somebody's going to need to do something about this, or I just can't stand this guy anymore. Whatever it is that he was thinking.
We don't know.
But it was Jesus telling him, go do what you have to do, that tips the scales. In the same way, it's like, I'm telling you, this is what you have to do. And Peter is the same way. Peter, I'm going to tell you what you're going to do. You say one thing, you think one thing, and another. This is what's going to actually happen.
So in that way, he handles them very similarly.
Very
and it
similarly.
is very, very interesting that Jesus gives orders to the evil one.
Yes.
Satan enters into Judas, and Jesus is the one ordering Satan
Right.
around.
Yeah.
I found that to be very, very interesting.
Yep.
But at the same time, so you've hit upon the things that he handles, how he handles both of these men similarly. The difference is that he lets Judas go,
Right.
as if Judas is completely hopeless.
Right.
And he stays with Peter. And there's something there that only Jesus can see, only
Right.
Jesus can understand. We can speculate about it, but
Yeah.
Judas is done.
Right.
And Judas is leaving the stage, and he's going to be condemned forever and ever.
Boy.
Peter is going to do something horrible. He's going to deny even know. But
Right.
he's going to be redeemed. He's going to
Right.
become the rock of the church. There's a statue of him in St. Peter's Square. You know? I
Right.
mean, how is that possible? Why is that? But we just don't know.
Well-
did Peter get more grace than Judas? We just don't know.
No. Yeah.
But he lets the one go into evil and fall into evil and disappear.
But what an earth-shattering, image-shattering event when you put it that way and you realize God does that. He lets people go.
Right.
Because isn't he supposed to save everyone?
Right.
No.
And he lets Peter deny him.
Yeah.
He
Yeah.
predicts that he's going to deny him, but he doesn't prevent that or put Peter in a position where that cannot happen. That is very interesting. The freedom there's a freedom that he gives. He's in control.
Right.
He's gracing. He's giving mercy. But there is also a freedom and therefore a responsibility that we have.
Yep. Amen.
And it's a holy mystery that we're never going to be able to divide out. But boy, is it fun, and it's fun.
We could sit here for another 3 hours.
Well, we
and
really
do that.
could, and take this apart. Nobody would be listening by that point.
We'd be done by then.
I'm surprised anybody's still hanging around. But these are the things. But we want to encourage you here at our podcast to do these wrestlings,
Right.
To ask these questions, because it's of great benefit when you do.
Yeah. And if you want to come talk to JD, we're here on
right.
Sundays at 9 and 11, and Wednesday nights at dinner at 5:45, and Bible study at 6:30.
Right, that's true, and I will do my best to avoid you.
Yes, if he sees you coming,
right,
he'll
I'll
know.
go the other way.
Yeah,
We kid because we care.
Yes.
This has been the Dundee Church Podcast,
Absolutely.
and this has been John chapter 13. And you can be guaranteed that we're not done yet. We will not avoid John chapter 14 next week. We will go after it, and we hope you join us then, don't we?
Absolutely, we hope you join us.
All right, we'll see you then.